Welcome everyone to the IGP's Soundbite this week. I'm Professor Henrietta Moore and I'm the founder and director of the Institute for Global Prosperity. I'm delighted that you're all with us, and it's my great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Bailey Kursar, who is founder of fintech-for-good, the Touco Lab. She's a financial inclusion advocate and a member also of the government's Financial Inclusion Policy Forum. Now, at Touco, Bailey has led the development of an app designed to help those with mental health problems better manage their money with the help of a family member or carer, and working with the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute and Northumbria University. Her team was able to develop this app with direct input from those with lived experience, adhering, in other words, to an inclusive design methodology, as we do at the IGP. And so we have lots of shared interest and overlap in those areas. Bailey's also an author of an industry guide to inclusive design, published by the Money Advice Trust and Fair by Design. And prior to founding Touco, Bailey worked at several early stage fintech companies, including Market Finance and Monzo. And she is passionate about how innovation in financial services can improve outcomes for those in vulnerable circumstances. And we're very lucky to have her today to talk to us. So Bailey, can I just get right into that and offer you the floor, and away you go. Welcome.
Thank you so much. What a lovely introduction. And I fear you have taken some of the headlines away from my talk, but that's okay. So lovely to meet everyone. Thank you for inviting me. And I hope this proves to be an interesting half hour, if nothing else. I know that it's a bit of a bizarre combination of topics that come together. Here is the opening slide. Just checking that you can see. It should say open banking, money management.
Yep, we can see very well. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Perfect. So it's a bizarre combination of things in one sentence, and particularly when you start including inclusive design and fintech and all of these other buzzwords. But nevertheless, this is the niche that I have found myself in. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about this specific project that Henrietta mentioned, and I can also mention more about the methodology that we use at Touco. Just to kind of outline what you'll get from my talk, I thought I would give you some background. It may or may not be something that you think about a lot, but a lot of people in the UK and worldwide suffer from mental health problems, and that does affect how we manage our money. But what's important to me, I suppose, as someone in industry, is what can we do about it? So I'll talk a little bit about that. Also, the innovation that we were lucky enough to be a part of at Touco with Money and Mental Health was really an effect of partnership. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, how it was funded as well, which is a really important, crucial part. And then again, I'll talk about inclusive design. So really the importance of inclusive design and the kinds of methods that we used to really make sure that we had the experience of people with lived experience at the heart of our design process. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. As Henrietta already mentioned, I have a background in fintech, doing all kinds of dog's body type roles, to be honest. I was a marketer, I was in product, and then I actually trained as a software engineer before starting my own company. And this is really what I'm known for, advocating for people in so-called vulnerable circumstances, which is industry speak for low income or having some kind of disability or impairment. And this is a little kind of diagram that I like to try and share with people in terms of who I am and what I stand for. I, at the moment, find myself in between two worlds that do have some overlap, but actually relatively little. Financial inclusion, so I'm a part of the Financial Inclusion Commission now, Financial Inclusion Policy Forum, and I am part of a University of Edinburgh organisation called the Global Open Finance Centre of Excellence, all of which is centred around how can we build out financial services so that they work for excluded groups. And then I also come from this background of fintech innovation and startup culture. So I have with me a toolkit, I suppose, that I've learned having worked for some of those early stage companies that I can start to apply more to these excluded groups. So that's me. Again, strange niche, but I love it. And this is how I got there. So I've worked in fintech for just about 10 years at some of these early stage companies, trained as a software engineer, and then founded Touco about 3-4 years ago now. I suppose the crucial part here is at what point did I start grappling with the questions about inclusivity and vulnerable customers? So as I said, I've worked for fintech for about a decade, and I really love what that movement of tech has been able to do to improve the financial services industry. But about 3 or 4 years ago, as well as several other times in my past, I actually went through a mental health episode, which meant that I was quite unwell. And having struggled with these things for several times in my life, I know that my mental health at that point was very poor, and I struggled with everyday tasks. So became very isolated, low on energy. And the last time that this happened, I had to take time off work to recover. I wouldn't have been able to be my normal confident self and get things done at work. And when I was at my most unwell, one of the things that really struck me was that I wasn't able to take care of my own money. I'm normally a very capable person, very confident, but at that point, I didn't feel able to open my bank statement or start a budget. And of course, when you're off work, that's the time when you need that kind of help the most, because you're off work, you're living off savings, you are much more in a financially precarious position. And what's more, that difficulty that I was experiencing, that financial difficulty, had an impact on my own mental health, which was this horrible vicious cycle, because I felt ashamed, I wasn't earning, and I was very low, that I was buying things that I couldn't afford to kind of pick me up, a quick way to feel better for a moment as well. So you end up in this cycle where your mental health is affected by the fact that you're not necessarily on top of your money management, and your money management then suffers because you're feeling ashamed and you're feeling incapable of managing. So I was really lucky to get the help that I needed to recover. And when I did get back to work doing what I love, I ended up working on products that help people manage their money. And in 2017 and 2018, I was working as a consultant on open banking projects. On this timeline here, it was when I was at Zopa. I was also doing a couple of other consulting projects at the time. And open banking is this fascinating new technology, really sparked by an EU directive aimed at making consumers own their data and really be able to do what they want with their data. And it was really exciting, really fun to play with this new tech. And I was really inspired at that time to think of new ways to use this new technology. What could we do with it? But at the same time, I was frustrated. I was frustrated by the fact that this new tech was often being used to help incumbents like Zopa, who were amazing, but had their own product, had their own service. It was being used to make them a shinier product, a product that moved the needle slightly for relatively well-off, tech-literate, urban, younger groups. So people who not necessarily needed a lot of extra help, but they were the target audience for a lot of these new open banking innovations. And so for me, I was thinking, how can we use this new exciting innovation and tech to actually move the needle a lot more for groups who actually aren't focused on when it comes to designing for fintech. And that's how Touco was born. We really focus on underserved groups. We focus on people who are excluded from a lot of other financial services innovation. And this was the first project that I'm going to describe to you that we ended up working on. So as I mentioned, I had my own mental health problems going into founding Touco, and it led me to really think of mental health as a very big, hairy problem that when I was thinking about inclusion, I thought mental health, where can we start here? And the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute, an amazing research charity whose publications are fantastic and I would recommend having a read, was founded around the time that I was looking at these things, and came out with a report very shortly after about how people with long-term mental health issues need extra support managing their money from family and friends and carers. So this report, Strength in Numbers, came out, and it talked about how those with mental health issues, just like myself, find themselves fluctuating in terms of capacity. So you may have a time in my life where I really need that extra help from, say, my husband or my parents, but a year later or 2 years later, God willing, that person is feeling a lot better and needs to go back into having control so that they can be independent and therefore build up their own mental health again. It's this cycle that I was talking about. So really that in this report leads the researchers to think about power of attorney as the kind of tool that has always been talked about as for people who want to delegate access to their finances and get help. But actually power of attorney is this really big, scary thing that means that you're handing over your power for the rest of your life. It's pretty inflexible. And even where there is some flexibility, the kind of perception of it from the general public is that it's not very flexible. So this kind of led me to really think about this problem. And to illustrate that, 1 in 4 people in the UK will experience a mental health problem this year. 1 in 5 of those, according to the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute's research, let someone else log into their online banking in order to do things on their behalf. But only 3% of those with mental health issues have used a power of attorney. So you can really see there the gap between the 20% who are letting someone log into their online banking, something that opens these very potentially vulnerable people up to financial abuse, and the 3% who actually go ahead and use a power of attorney. So this is the problem that we thought about solving in our first prototype, our first project. And this was the idea initially that I had. I thought that we could have the user, someone who self-identified as having money and mental health problems, download some kind of app or service. They would then use that to connect their bank accounts using open banking, and they would customize alerts based on their spending or their bank balance, the kind of alerts that you can often do for your own bank account for yourself. But in this case, they would be inviting a family member, a friend, someone who would act as a very informal type of carer in order to receive those text messages, as well as the user themselves. So both would receive one. And then over the course of using this app, the SMS alert would get sent when triggered, and that would hopefully invite this intervention that could help improve outcomes for that user. So the family member would receive a text, they would then be able to have a chat, they might be able to go to the bank with that person. At the time, it was very much just, this is possible using open banking, why don't we try it? And as I said, I was really lucky to have access to amazing organisations who could help fund and help in other ways this project. So Nationwide had at the time a programme called Open Banking for Good, who actually funded the project. And the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute ended up being our partner and helping us access people with lived experience. And Northumbria University School of Design, one of the professors there and a PhD candidate worked with us in order to help make sure that we had safeguarding in place, make sure that we used appropriate research methodologies and wrote 2 papers off the back of it. So this really is about partnership at the heart. Oops. So co-design, let me tell you about how we did this. We started off with some biographical interviews. We wanted to reach the research community from the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute. So we did, actually the first thing we did was a survey, which got to about 300 of their participants, who gave us very high level data about how they were thinking about getting help from family and friends around their money management. From there, we asked a smaller group of those if they would be interested in being part of a co-design group with us. And from there, we narrowed it down until we invited, I think we invited about 30 people, and we ended up with 14 on our pilot. And that's 14 people with mental health problems who were on our pilot. And then they in turn invited a family member in order to be part of it too. So we ended up with this nice group, quite small group of people who were testing the app and giving us constant feedback. In order to bring this to life, I thought I would share with you the story of one of our participants, who I'm calling Sarah. Sarah was a 40-year-old woman from Blackburn who joined the co-design group in 2019. And it's not her real name, but she's a real person. She's lovely, loyal, positive, very close to her family. She enjoys doing puzzles, but she also suffers with poor health. And when we met, she had been waiting for back surgery for about 2 years, and her mental health had got worse as a result. And she'd been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, depression, and agoraphobia. So she finds it hard to leave the house. She'd been unable to work, and although she didn't want to, she had to apply for benefits and use a food bank, which made her feel ashamed. And what made it worse is that her mental health affects her spending and her ability to manage her money. So she found financial products too daunting. She was a hoarder and she just struggled to control her spending. She had been in debt for a while and told us that she found it really daunting to get help. The really interesting thing about Sarah to me was that she had a great support network around her, but she struggled to ask them for help. Her younger sister is a midwife and has her own family and problems, so it's difficult to get her help. And her mum, who she lived with, had her own mental health problems. And so there was this feeling of being a burden for Sarah. She unfortunately told us that she had at times been suicidal because of this feeling of being a burden. So Sarah was one of the 14 who we took through this co-design experience. As I say, we did biographical interviews that kind of led us to think about the design of the app. And this is how it ended up looking, broadly it ended up looking. We kind of played around with the design quite a bit. But as you can see, it was a very simple Android and iPhone app so that someone could use this to connect their bank accounts. And then we had hopefully quite calming visuals so that people could have a look, see if they'd got an alert. And then crucially to the right here, you can see there was signposting in the app. So if someone did have an alert, we could suggest various different things that they could be doing, as well as obviously talking that through with their chosen family member. We asked our co-design group to participate in a diary study, which was amazing. We did a lot of affinity mapping during the project. And as I said, we fed all of that back into the design as we went. And the pilot itself lasted 3 months over the summer in 2019. And this is Sarah during the pilot. So when we gave her access to Touco, the app, she decided to set up alerts around her spending that would get sent to her sister. And whenever she overspent in a day or her balance dropped below a certain point, that meant her sister would get a text message. And the idea was that she would gently get in touch to offer if she could help. As you can imagine, the first text that Sarah got felt quite daunting, but because her sister had got it too, she was able to open up and ask for help. Her sister came round later that day and they sat in front of a laptop and went through her transactions one by one. And from then on, whenever Sarah got a text, she knew she could wait and go through her problems informally with her sister. Sarah also used the app that I showed you, and she noticed one of the links in there was to Step Change. So she ended up talking to Step Change and getting help for her debt. And every conversation that went by, her sister and her would come up with more and more practical support on how to help with money. They would cook together, they would buy coffee and basics together. Her sister advised her to switch to an e-cigarette to save money. And one of the things that happened was Sarah went to a wedding. She thought she needed to spend loads of money on a new dress, but her sister helped her go, no, we don't need that. You've got stuff you can wear. And my favorite part of the story was that the day before we did the closing interview in the study, both of them together had sat down and started an eBay account as a practical way to generate cash from Sarah's hoarding. And they were talking about what they were going to spend all the money on, which was great. So it really made the two feel closer as sisters. And importantly, it meant that Sarah felt she had someone to talk to about her problems. This is one quote that she gave us. She talked about the positive impact that it had and that it helped her look at her bank account, and it really helped her open up about her finances. I don't have time to tell you all the stories from the trial, but there is a report if you're interested. Here are just some of the other quotes. So Robert, who said that he was more aware of his spending. Kristen, who had dissociative episodes, so she would spend money when she wasn't aware of it, and then the next morning she would see the alert and be able to cancel the order. And Anna was one of the partners, one of the carers, and she just said that their relationship about talking about money had really been transformed. So to start wrapping up, I suppose for me, this is all about shining a light on a niche problem, but giving you an idea of a template that can be used for lots of other inclusive design problems as well, which is really thinking about how we can help design products that can be accessed and used by everyone, by starting with users who have these out of the ordinary needs and working really closely with those users in close consultation with people who are experts by experience. And to kind of bring that to life, Rachel Edwards, who was one of our trial participants, she has very happily gone on the record, and she's talked about her experience with us and other companies doing this type of work. And she really is an advocate for this. She wants companies to ask real people with real stories, which I think is really important. And I suppose the last part of the puzzle for open innovation and for inclusive design, when I talk to companies, is that I love talking about how they could open source some of their findings. I think that designing for vulnerable circumstances shouldn't be a competitive issue. It should be about opening these things up and helping everyone learn from each other. So at Touco, we released an industry report called Let's Talk About Money. And Belén Barros Peña, who worked with us as a PhD candidate, she's released 2 papers on this pilot as well. And as Henry said, this also made it into the industry guide on inclusive design that I wrote earlier this year. And just to close, here's a quote from that guide that kind of sums up, I suppose, my philosophy in terms of what we at Touco stand for. So I believe before we can design for inclusion, we really have to understand what it feels like to be excluded. And that can be an uncomfortable process because we need to ask what our customers are excluded from, and that forces us to consider our own privileges. But it forces us to review how our own bias contribute to other people feeling excluded. And I think that's a really necessary discomfort that we as designers need to put ourselves through in order to come out with more inclusive design. Okay, I think I've probably talked enough. Thank you
very much. Thank you very much for that remarkable story. I mean, before I open up to the floor, let's perhaps just have a little chat between you and me. So one of the things I was very taken with was this idea of going from money stressed to money sorted. I like that. I thought it was a really wonderful phrase, which is on the front of the app. And but what's happening with Touco now then? I mean, how many people might be using the app? What's the rollout been like? Because you rolled out predominantly through the pandemic, which must have been quite a challenge. Yeah?
So no, we didn't actually. So unfortunately, this is a project rather than a company. Right. At the time, the business model we had in mind was that we would work hand in hand with enterprises, banks, and we would help roll out the app to their customer base. Unfortunately, given the pandemic and other circumstances, that hasn't come to fruition. And so what we now do is work more on how we can help companies do their own inclusive design projects. Right. So I would love to see this app incorporated, I suppose, into banking.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that.
Because it is fundamentally what we tested was more of a feature than a product. But the business model question, I think, is a really important question when we think about designing for excluded groups. And unfortunately, for this particular project, at the moment, I don't see how we can ethically make money from this type of product rollout. It's, to be honest, when I take a step back and I think about the work that I do with the Financial Inclusion Commission and other things, really the business model question is the bigger umbrella question that I think we could talk for another half hour about
Oh,
if you're interested.
yeah.
But from working in places like Monzo, Market Finance, SOPA, these are VC funded companies. They are juggernauts. They are built for growth and for revenue, and therefore designing inclusively can drop down the priority list. I think in order to be thoughtful and build companies that are less profit driven, more social impact driven, we need to rethink how we fund those and how we think about the business model. And I haven't cracked that yet, but
no,
watch this
it's a
space.
very interesting question, and it's something that we get quite a lot in the work that we do with the IGP. And you know, I think one of the issues here is that it's very likely, I think, that in the future that a lot of big companies will have to think about having a portfolio of offerings, and not all of which actually directly make cash, right?
Yeah.
Or profit. In other words, that, you know, there has to be a way in which you could think of having an app of this kind as improving your ability to interact with those people who are otherwise hard to reach, who would then make up another part of your market share, or various other ways of thinking about what your longer term impact there would be, or helping, you know, having people who bank with you, who know that you're willing to help other people that they're connected to, or other people in their community who are vulnerable. So I think there are plenty of models here, but I think that it's looking to actually extract value at every point of interaction that creates a lot of the difficulties we have, I think. And it's a very interesting point.
No, absolutely. And I think two things to add to that, I suppose. One is that there is regulatory pressure as well as consumer pressure now on the bigger banks to think more about inclusivity. The FCA came out with guidance on designing for vulnerable customers in January this year, I think. And that's yet to really come to fruition, but I think there will be more and more pressure on companies to think more like this in the future. And then the other point that I wanted to make was that this is almost, I mean, it's a good and a bad thing, right? But I think this is almost a story of open banking enabled this type of testing and this type of product innovation and research in a way that would never have been possible prior to having open banking. So maybe it doesn't matter so much. Obviously it's difficult for me because I wanted to build a business and I couldn't, but maybe it doesn't matter so much that there's not a business behind that feature, because actually it's about testing that and then realizing that there is value there and then building it into the core product. Again, the open banking movement and ecosystem is something that we could talk much more about if people are interested, but I think that's going to be one of the big benefits of open banking, is that it enables testing of products and services very quickly that could then be much more mainstream over time. So yeah.
No, I can see what you're saying, and I think it connects to something else that we've done quite a lot of work on in the IGP too, which is that there is some unhappy relationship between inclusion and innovation in lots of spaces.
Yeah.
Somehow we don't seem to be able to pull those two things together in the way that we need to. And that's really interesting, especially when you hear a lot of people now, you know, in the sort of media sphere and elsewhere, you hear people talking all the time about something called inclusive growth. And you know very well that that this growth is not inclusive, whatever it might be. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's the big hairy question that I'm really interested in talking to people about and trying to solve over 5-10 years, because I do think that the traditional VC funded model for fintech, which has led to a lot of great innovation, it does leave gaps, and sometimes it doesn't just leave gaps, it actually creates further exclusion through digital exclusion. So there are things that we need to think about as an industry that are not just purely profit driven. And
I agree. I think that's really important. Fintech is interesting in that regard. Well, we've got Bailey, a whole lot of very excited people piling up in the questions. So let me just start with first of all with Justin Van Wyk, who is saying, thank you, Bailey. You may have mentioned this, but how effective was this, I think he's talking of the app and the co-design, with men versus women. And the reason I'm asking is because men tend to seek financial and mental health less often than women.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We didn't, again, it was a very small sample, 14 people. And I'll have to remind myself of the actual split, but it was more women than men. I think it was 4 men and 10 women off the top of my head.
Yeah.
So I can't really speak to it statistically, but I can say that we were very lucky to have access to the research community through the charity, but it did mean that the people that we were co-designing with had already put their hand up and said, I have a mental health issue, I am happy to be part of a co-design group. So you have to be mindful of that. Certainly when we did tests outside of this group, we found it was predominantly female as well. A lot of women who were happy to download it and test it versus men who were less keen. But interestingly, the men who did use it said that they did have really good experiences. So, and as I mentioned in one of the slides, you know, it meant that talking about money was more on the table for them and their partner. Most of the people who we trialed with used their spouse as their carer. So it meant that money problems were no longer swept under the carpet. But yeah. We need more data, I think, to answer that properly.
Yes, but interesting that you had quite a lot of people, as you say, with couples, so as the carer. So that's interesting in itself. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, we had a good mix, but I think 8 of the 14, off the top of my head, were spouses, and then parents and siblings, apart from one who had a friend who was that person. But the nice thing about it was that the text message that that person got didn't include any detail around their friends or family members' financial circumstances.
No.
What the text message that the carer got simply said, there's been a trigger, we'd recommend you
get in touch. Yeah.
So it did open up, I think, people to choose more informal friends, people who they weren't necessarily talking to about money a lot. Yeah. Which was nice.
Yes, which opens up that whole issue. And then we have, I think, a comment really from Naima Hakani saying, this is such a great initiative, Bailey. More than anything, I love how much you can see compassion interwoven throughout the design of your product. So remember they're coming.
That's very kind.
Say that. Now we have 2 questions from our wonderful conference room, because we're fully hybrid here, so we have people who are together. So can we move to the conference room, please, Chris, and welcome everybody there.
Are we on camera? I can't.
You are. Sorry. You're fully on camera. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bailey. I'm going to let Hannah ask a question first, and then I'm going to ask my question second, so that we keep things very simple with turning cameras on and off and speakers on off. So Hannah, go.
Yeah. Thank you. Bailey, thank you so much. I just wanted to say in particular for sharing your own experience of having mental ill health and how that has inspired you to do what you're doing now. I think it's really fantastic. So my question is really about the research process. I'm interested in working with people who are struggling with their mental health on research projects. And I was interested in your experience of doing research with your participants. And I was wondering if you could particularly talk to the different mental health needs that people had. If I guess, you know, you've got a group of people with very different mental health issues, then that creates a whole realm of stress and difficulty. So I was quite interested to know how you dealt with that.
Oh, 100%. That's such a great question. I'll try not to talk for too long on it. There is more information on some of the things I'll say in the industry guide that I mentioned. I'll pop it in the chat shortly. So first off, I would say safeguarding was a really important concern for us to address and to write quite a comprehensive policy and procedure document on that. We worked a little bit with the Money Mental Health Policy Institute on that, taking some of the work that they'd already done. And then Belen, who worked with us as a PhD candidate, she had done her own work on that. So it went through a couple of iterations, and it meant that even though we were a very small team at the time, so Touco was, I think, 3 people at this point, each of us in the team who would ever have had the opportunity to interact with participants, we had to read that, we had to think about it. It included, for example, a commonly used suicide prevention framework. So for talking to people who are talking to you over the phone or texting, and how you can manage that. And obviously, as part of that safeguarding policy, our biggest point there was we have partners here who know much more than us. We've put those in place, so we've thought this through beforehand. I think, since this project, thankfully nothing in this project went terribly wrong, although we did have one interesting story, which was one of our participants had a paranoid episode during the project, and so felt that his phone had been hacked and threw it away, which opened up some really interesting data ethics questions that, again, I can go into another time, because he didn't have access to the app to change his settings or delete the app. But again, when we checked in with him face to face, he was more than happy to be still part of the project. It was just this fluctuating mental health issue that he had experienced. I digress. Safeguarding was very important, is the key point there. The second thing that I wanted to mention was kind of more practical in terms of mental health, which was communication preferences. So again, I think the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute have a document that talks about various communication preferences from the point of view of customer service from a bank, but it's basically as applicable for us as researchers. So things like some people we spoke to preferred to conduct all their interviews over like a normal telephone rather than a face-to-face Zoom or face-to-face in person. We had someone who would rather do it over email, so we did it over email. And so these different kinds of communication preferences meant that we could flex, I suppose, to various different needs when it came to the stress. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention on this topic, which again, there's a little bit more in the guide, is around vulnerability in general. Mental health, obviously a big part of that, because as part of any research project that I've been in a part of, there are incentives, and these people were either on benefits or on very low income mainly. So thinking about how the economic incentive and participation works for them, but then also when that stops being the case at the end of the trial, how you're going to support them from there. And that was also something that we thought a bit about, because at the end of this trial, I think it's all in the guide in the report, but I think it was it ended up being £100 worth of vouchers that we incentivized people with over the course of the trial. And at the end, we offered people appointments to talk to someone who could help them with benefits, etc. That was part of our reasoning, is that we need to make sure these people are economically okay after this. Anyway, lots of things, I suppose, is my answer. But safeguarding, communication preferences, and incentive management were my key points.
Thank you very much. So, Chris.
Well, yeah, we've added another question. Anya, I think, wanted to ask a question too.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Billy. That was fantastic. I'm particularly interested in the business model, just because that's an area that I study. And I'm wondering if you considered a licensing approach. That's one. And then two, instead of banks, or I think I heard you mention nationwide, instead of banks perhaps working with charities, so that you're licensing to the charities who already have the capability to protect the users. And I'm talking about large charities like Crisis, St. Mungo's, the various charities that do work around this space that could use the app with their users. So I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, and thank you. Yeah, we've looked at lots of different possibilities. At the moment, I am doing a project with many organisations, one of which is Shelter, as an example. One of the barriers but I think this will start to be less of a case over the next few years, is cost. So for any non-enterprise level customer, even a big charity, they will look at the unit economics of this, and it's hard to justify. Open banking is more, it's a better unit cost than, say, a prepaid card, which is also something we worked on at Touco. But with all of these types of technology, the way that you innovate is that you work with outside partners. So we didn't own the open banking rails in this app. We used an outsourced, and at the time, I think it was a few £100 for that, not a huge cost. But as that scales, it becomes more and more expensive. And so that's something that you have to think about when you find partners. They have to be able to justify that cost. I think watch this space a little bit on the charity point, because I think after the first couple of years of open banking having been a bit of a off-putting time, I think, for charities, for GDPR reasons as well as others, I think now they're starting to realise more and more what the potential is. And then in terms of licensing, that was our initial business model. I think I've come to terms with the fact that this particular packaging of the app isn't the right thing, but I think over time it could be incorporated into something else that we do. And like I say, for me now, it's less about championing this specific app. It's more about championing the way that we've built it and thinking about how we can incorporate some of those features into other product sets. For example, Monzo, who, I'm biased because I used to work for them, but they are looking at how they can create more of these types of alerts. You might be aware of a gambling block that they built. They're looking at how they can use that same technology to block against other kinds of spending, So that's a really exciting area for me. How can we collaborate with those kinds of companies to use their own technology so that it's not so costly? Yeah.
Great. No, we're still in the collaboration room, I think. Chris.
Yeah, one final question. Thank you so much. Bailey, I wanted to, a quick thought on this ongoing conversation. I know the money advice sector is essentially funded through this almost like tax on banking or financial services. So I was wondering if there's any way to access that. But the actual question I had was a bit broader. I was reading the recent Money and Mental Health Institute report, and one of the questions they asked about kind of online financial behavior is, would this be acceptable offline? And to use that as a kind of moral standard for design in various sort of arenas like gambling and shopping, etc. But I wanted to flip the question, since your experience with online or digital design, and the question is simply, what do you think we could learn about offline or non-digital money and mental health issues from what you've done in the digital realm?
Oh, that's an interesting question, because I don't see it that way. I see the specific project that I've told you about today really as being digital enabling real life. The digital almost could be invisible. The app that we built, partly because we were grant funded and a small team, was very simple, but actually the simplicity of it in some ways was totally fine and appropriate, because we didn't want people to be going on the app. We wanted people to be having a in real life conversation that we believe, even though it's a small sample, definitely showed a lot of positive benefits for those people. So I think for me, the question is more, how should industry think more about the offline potential of and bring in offline elements? I think the kind of thing that we've done here, which is open up conversations about money, isn't just about people with mental health problems, it's about everyone. When we did testing after this particular project, we tested with some couples who had no vulnerability particularly, but it was just helping them have conversations about money. So for me, it just comes back to the digital. I think the danger as a digital designer or a digital product manager is that, what's the phrase, you know, every nail you use your own hammer, right? And it's that kind of thinking. If you're a digital designer, you're only thinking about what that person is doing when they log into that app and how they're interacting with the screens. That's the data that you have. And so it's really easy to just be blindsided by that. But actually thinking about everything that person is going through in their day-to-day life, I think helps you design much better interactions with the product. And I think this is something that's not just about finance, it's about tech in general. And I think over the next 10 years, we'll see more and more move to away from engagement stats as our North Star in tech, and the fact that we have, you know, X number of hours engagement, and more to other kinds of metrics that I think can be more helpful. I think that's where consumers want this industry to go as well. So I don't think I've answered your question, but I'm just kind of turning it on the head a little bit.
That's totally
Very good.
fair, because it's a distinction that doesn't hold, right? Offline and online are not two separate things, but totally blurred. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yes, well, try telling the university that with regard to delivery of teaching now. Okay, so let's move on. So another question. So from Peter Waters saying, thank you. Were there any negative findings from the user research? And if so, how did you adapt the project?
Oh, yes, there were. And it's a good test of my memory. The two that come to mind that were probably the biggest, because I remember them now. One was about the limitations of the tech itself. So we had plenty of feedback from users saying that the triggered alerts were at the wrong time of day. What they were expecting, and I suppose what I would expect as well as a consumer if I knew nothing about the underlying tech, would be I go into a shop, I spend the money, if I trigger the alert, I get the alert immediately then. But because of the way that open banking works, for most banks, that alert would come the next day. It's kind of more of a batch processing. It's not as tech sophisticated as people would like to think, I think. So that was one of the findings, that the alerts system worked really well, but actually it sometimes was delayed, and that created problems for that interaction, the kind of intervention that we wanted to create. What was another? Like, we had a couple of informal carer people who said that they had got a lot of text messages because, and this again is an interesting one in terms of design. I think this is something that could be worked out better in the future. It's I've not got enough time to tell you everything, but essentially the person with the mental health problem had the app, and therefore they controlled the settings. The person who received the text messages did not have any, at that point, control over frequency. It was just they got the text messages as and when. So if this person had an alert coming out, you know, that ended up being triggered every day, it became noise, if that makes sense, to the other person. And so some way of differentiating text messages was something that was suggested to us, and we played around after this project with various ways of doing that. But yeah, overall, the mechanism itself, people said was beneficial, but it was the way that the mechanism worked, I think, that could definitely be improved upon. To some extent, I think open banking being improved now may mean it's better. We're now talking about 2 years ago, this test. But yeah, there are still limitations to the tech, unfortunately.
All right. Well,
hopefully that made sense. I know.
Yes, no, that
getting into the weeds a little bit, I suppose.
No, that made very good sense. And now we've got, I'm looking at time, but I think we have time for another 2 questions. So the first one is from Juan, saying financially including vulnerable people will bring positive aspects to them, but it could produce some negative effects, such as stress of managing debt over long periods or with big interest rates, leading to aggravating certain mental health problems. So financial inclusion is viewed generally only as a solution without considering its potential problems. And how important is it to you not only to consider financial inclusion as an end in itself, but also the details on how people are being financially included, how they are financially included?
Yeah, I think, again, I'll kind of disagree with the premise, I suppose, and try and turn that question around a little bit, because for me, financial inclusion is a buzzword and I'm not a massive fan a lot of the time, but it is the word that everyone uses. Because when people say financial inclusion, sometimes it leads to lots of different interpretations. Often people think it's about people who are unbanked. That tends to be one of the legacy things of the last kind of 20 years, financial inclusion. If everyone has a bank account, everyone's included. Well, for me, that's not the case. So for me, and this is only my personal opinion, financial inclusion for me means, in what ways does the current financial services industry and system exclude certain people, certain groups, and what are the ways that we can help those groups become more included in that industry and that system? So the example given in the question, I would say, is about innovation that might be intended to drive inclusion. So for example, buy now, pay later, you could argue, could be an innovation that is driving inclusion. It's helping people not get credit cards. It's helping people take credit out without high interest rates. However, that innovation may have other knock-on effects, some of which may be unintended consequences that can actually drive exclusion. So innovation is, for me, a neutral. It doesn't necessarily mean innovation is good or bad. It's just sometimes there are good, positive, inclusive benefits, and sometimes there are exclusions that come off the back of that. And so I think the question for us as in the industry, as regulators, as designers, is always, how do we balance that? And if we are, if we are creating innovation, it's likely we are in some way creating exclusion. And how do we balance that? How do we think about that? How are we mindful about that? So yeah, I think hopefully helpful, but I would just, there's a lot of nuance there, and it's not a kind of black and white way of thinking. I think exclusion comes in lots of different ways, in lots of different flavors. So yeah, hopefully helpful.
Yes, inclusion and exclusion, that's one of the issues, isn't it? But interesting, as we said at the beginning, that innovation and inclusion have an unhappy relationship, or a difficult relationship. So we have a final question, I think, from Nikolai, who's saying, thank you for the great talk. Did users of the app ever feel surveyed or under surveillance by knowing that other people could be notified of activities by an app? And is there a possibility that this could be a downside with respect to mental health, being under sort of scrutiny?
Yeah, 100%. So in our, again, going back to kind of this specific trial, everyone signed up to this. They knew what they were signing up for. So we didn't have people who were saying, this feels bad to be surveyed. I think if I look at the alternative that is most often used, power of attorney, that does definitely cause people with mental health problems who use it to feel surveyed in some ways. And the Money and Mental Health Policy Research Institute's research would be the place to start if you want to find out more about that. And again, I'll kind of tell you the upside rather than the downside of the kind of surveillance, which was, we found one of the kind of interesting benefits of this intervention, this app, was that the users were much more mindful of the spending they were doing because of the fact that they knew they might trigger a text message. And so it caused them to think twice about spending where they might have before just gone ahead and spent. You could argue that that is always a good thing if someone is on a low income. You could also argue that that could be damaging. But again, I would say it's an interesting finding. And just having that accountability, I suppose, is something that, again, is an interesting thing that we can maybe build into more products and services.
Yeah, I think that it's a very interesting issue, though, isn't it? How people will respond to these things. And I guess that over time, people have become more used to being surveyed, if you like, by their devices. we're all increasingly have that sense of living in a world where we're being checked on by our devices. So perhaps that's something where cultural attitudes might be shifting over time from the past.
Yeah. But I accept it's one thing to be surveyed by a device and another to be surveyed by your partner or there are potential downsides to this type of collaborative accountability type tech. And again, it comes back to what I said before, is like the innovation itself, you have to see as neutral, but there may be upsides, there may be downsides.
Maybe downsides. Well, thank you so much. What a fantastic talk, Bailey. I mean, and wonderful work. And we hope that we find a business model that will allow this to move out into the world, definitely.
Well, if I may, I'll just quickly mention, so as I said, at the moment, we do various different projects. One of the things that I'm working on at the moment is with the University of Edinburgh's Global Open Finance Centre of Excellence. And there we are looking to collaborate with academics, with industry, with regulators, and do more of this kind of inclusive design project in industry. So if anyone is interested in learning more about that, do reach out. I will share my details with the organisers.
Great, brilliant, absolutely great. Yes, thank you for that offer too. And thank you for finding the time to come and talk to us at the IGP. We've had a wonderful session and really enjoyed it. Lots of good questions. And now, because we're fully hybrid and very sophisticated at the IGP, of course, with all kinds of devices, everyone's going to turn their cameras on so we can give you a round of applause.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, I'll share my details if there are any other questions.
Lovely. And I hope we get to see you again soon. Thank you very much for your time.
You.
Okay, bye. Bye.